Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. It's been a little while, had our Christmas break, but now I'm back here with my buddy, my partner in crime, Pastor Jon. How you doing, Pastor Jon?
Ho, 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 Merry Christmas.
We're done. You're not allowed to do that again until what, July?
I don't know. I mean, it depends who you ask.
You start saying Merry Christmas after Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah. In our household, it's after Thanksgiving.
Okay.
But there's all sorts of like insider jokes and stuff that we make all year long. Like we're already making the insider Christmas jokes, quotes from movies and dumb stuff.
It's already time. We're not even a month out.
No, man, it's so sad. I love Advent. It was a ton of fun, but
it's kind of interesting that first January is always just a different month from any other month of the year, kind of coming out of the craziness of the holidays, but sometimes it's its own craziness because it's the beginning of new things. So
I think it's unique too in the Northwest because things get very dark.
Yeah,
like physically dark. There's not a lot of sunlight. Like when you wake up in the morning, it's dark. You come home at night, it's dark. It's raining a lot, and so that starts to happen while you're like anticipating Christmas. So there's a little bit of excitement, and then once Advent is come and gone and the decorations are down, it's just dark and wet. And so it's like, it's depressing.
And we didn't even get snow. We had this big, huge snow forecast and it never came.
Whoa. Yeah, it rains all the time except for when it's below 32.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say that's the coldest it's been in a long time. They're like 18, 16 degrees up here. So,
yeah, pretty awesome.
Well,
but here we are. It's Monday and we're back to Exodus.
Back to Exodus. And we picked up after our Advent, and we had a couple one-off things that you touched on in January, and now we're back in Exodus. So, Exodus 13.
Yes, sir.
We're picking up right at the, we took a break right at the end of basically Passover, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then we're picking up with the people are leaving. They're actually departing. They're exodusing. This is what the book was named after. This part, the Exodus of God's people from Egypt, and things kind of slow down a little bit because after the Passover, God gives them a lot of instruction, and that instruction comes in. There's a little bit of drama and movement in chapter 13, but there's a lot of instruction, and so
there's a lot of instruction, yeah,
and there's a lot of interesting information.
It can feel anticlimactic too because you just finished the confrontation of the 10 plagues, and you just had the Passover, and God's brought judgment on Egypt, and he's rescued his people, and now they're leaving Egypt, and you immediately go to regulations with meals and animals.
Yep. So when you preached on this, there are a couple topics that came up, and one was the firstborn sons, because I think the chapter opens with God basically telling them that the firstborn son is to be consecrated to him, and the firstborn of all animals are to be sacrificed to him.
Yes.
And then after that, there's a couple things he touched on with, the nation and how this is the birth of a nation. And with that is not just the family of Israel, is also the mixed multitude, right?
Yeah.
And so what the heck is that? What does that mean? And then the last thing you talked about, or I'm not even sure if I'm doing the order you talked about, but one of the things you talked about also was this idea of God instituting, meals and things of remembrance for his people, because it's almost like the reason the narrative stops here is because he's giving them instructions so that they don't forget what's happening in the narrative.
Yeah.
So the first question I have is about the firstborn sons. So what is going on with God telling this people, this nation, to consecrate the firstborn sons? What does it mean to be consecrated? Because one thing I'll say is that I've heard deconstructed Christians say that this is an old pagan influence in the text. God was basically commanding child sacrifice of the firstborn sons. So what is going on with the firstborn sons?
Well, it's not that. If you just read the text, it's very clear that the firstborn males, the first male to open the womb, so a son, is to be redeemed, and the firstborn male to open the womb of an animal is to be sacrificed. And there's a consecration that happens in both of those, but they're They're not the same thing. And the instructions are very, very clear. So if someone wants to go back and kind of read stuff into that account, a lot of times, I don't want to oversimplify like refuting, deconstructing, but read the text.
Yeah.
And it usually is pretty clear. And there's nothing about child sacrifice. Child sacrifice is an abomination in Israel, and it's ridiculous. Just read it.
Yeah, I think that I wonder if there might have been another passage brought up where it's like referencing the same idea, and I can't remember where it is off the top of my head. But one of the things that I think that the reason why they read into it is in this other passage, which I can't remember. It uses the same word that often gets translated as burnt offering. And it's like, but the word for burnt offering is itself a pretty elaborate translation of the word used in Hebrew. The word is olah, which just means going up. So you would, for that firstborn animal sacrifice, which was a burnt offering, right? Which you literally would kill and you'd burn it until it's completely burnt up. All the smoke would go up, right? Up into the glory cloud, as it were. And so but the word was just going up. It was a going up offering. And when a person is a going up offering, people don't go up.
Correct.
In smoke. They go up to serve in the tabernacle.
Right.
They go up to serve, and that language comes from Exodus 20, where Moses goes up Sinai, comes down Sinai, goes up Sinai. And the people aren't allowed to go up, but Moses can go up because Moses has been called by God as a representative to serve in a very priestly manner. And I think that's one of the things you talked about, is that this consecration is for the sake of service.
It's service, which then is going to be replaced by the Levitical priesthood.
Yes.
But at this point in the development of Israel as a people, this is the duty of the firstborn sons. And it makes sense that when you're coming out of Egypt, the amount of that mixed multitude in terms of what the numbers were, and there's different theories and debates about it. It's clearly hundreds of thousands. Drawing from that versus when you have that group keeps multiplying, right? Then it's like, now you can narrow down and you can draw from one particular group because you don't need all of them.
Yeah, if you're interested in learning about that, I think it's Numbers 3:12 where it makes it clear that the firstborn get replaced by the Levites. So there's a progression, and it's an interesting progression because there's a progression from and weirdly enough, Levite becoming the source of the priesthood is a bit of redemption for Levi, because Levi is one of the sons who has this curse upon him from Jacob because I think isn't it Levi and Reuben who go and kill all the people in Shechem?
I don't remember if that was Levi or not, but I know the curses that Jacob gives, and some blessings, but on his sons.
I think that Levi is one of the guys who goes and slaughters the Shechem people because of defiling Dinah. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on.
Because Jacob didn't do his job.
That's right. Jacob. Yeah. So
anyways.
So but you made a really interesting connection that I actually had not heard before when it comes to the firstborn son. And it really made me think about it a little differently, which is this idea that it's not just this firstborn son acts as a kind of embodied representation of something God's done for Israel.
Yeah.
And that Israel is the firstborn son. Can you talk a little bit more about I guess that and the implications of that? Because the implications are what really kind of surprised me, but I think it's really cool. Yeah.
So when you read chapter 12 and you go right into chapter 13, the first thing you get is the firstborn, the first to come forth from the womb, is to be consecrated. And when you read it, it feels like the subject is changing, right? But you realize the subject's not changing. God is actually describing what has just happened. So I don't have the Bible in front of me. I should have done that. But when it talks about the firstborn from the womb being consecrated, right, the first son, it's describing what had just happened with Israel exiting Egypt. There's a birth that has taken place. There's the womb of Egypt, so to speak, has been broken, and a firstborn has come out. And that firstborn is not a singular person. That firstborn is the mixed multitude. It is Abraham's family and those that had joined them in that Exodus. And that theme also, it flows into into chapter 14, which you preached yesterday, which we'll get in the next episode. But you also have like birthing through the water, the breaking of the water, and the child coming out with the crossing of the Red Sea. Yep. So the consecration of the firstborn, and that instruction coming right on the tail of the Exodus is it's a description. It's explaining, it's framing the story. What is coming out of Egypt is God's firstborn. And that's not the first time that we're introduced into that language in Exodus 4, when God is talking to Moses and telling Moses to talk to Pharaoh. He refers to Israel, which would really be like Jacob's family at that point, is his firstborn son. And so as Pharaoh does to God's firstborn son, God will do to Pharaoh's firstborns and the firstborns of Egypt. But that whole consecrating thing is all meant to frame the Exodus event. What's coming out of Egypt is the first to break the womb. It's God's firstborn, a people who are collectively God's firstborn son. So there's an identity piece to that, but then there's a calling that comes with that, right? So to be consecrated is to be set apart for something. So God is taking a group of people, and it's really interesting to track the development of that group. When the story of Exodus begins, we're told that it's like 70 people, right? So you had Joseph in Egypt, Jacob and the other brothers. There's a famine; they're going to die. Joseph is in a position of power, and he rescues them. And then, so now you have 70 people in Egypt. And then it switches to the beginning of Exodus, where we're told again 70 people. But what's leaving is no longer 70 people. It's not this family reunion anymore. It's something huge. And it's described as a mixed multitude, meaning you do have biological descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but you also have different families, different ethnicities, people who are now joining into this group, which is why in Exodus 12, you have the instructions about what is required for them to participate in the Passover, right? That whole thing makes no sense if these are just ethnic Abraham's
Jews.
Relatives. If they're just ethnic Jews, right? So you have this.
I actually sometimes think that ethnic Jews is a misnomer because they're really from this. I mean, you can take it back even to Abraham, right? You have this Ishmael Isaac thing where there's a covenant given to Ishmael, but there's also a covenant given to Isaac. But the covenant that makes the Jewish, what makes you a Jew is the covenant that gets passed down to Isaac, not to Ishmael. So there's ethnicities there, but ethnicity doesn't matter. I mean, this is kind of what Romans 9 is all about, right? Like,
oh my gosh, On the Sunday that I preached this sermon, I had someone come up to me and say, "Okay, so explain to me, is God still doing something with Israel?" And so my answer to that was, "What do you mean by Israel?"
Yeah,
it's like, are you talking about like the descendants from Abraham? Are you talking about an ethnic reality? Are you talking about
covenantal reality?
A covenantal reality, because really, it becomes very, very clear. It is clear earlier in Genesis, like you said, when you have Isaac and Ishmael. Well, both of those are descendants of Abraham, but one of them is a covenant member. So you're already seeing that the primary thing that makes Israel is it's a covenantal reality. That comes more clearly into focus with the mixed multitude who are leaving Egypt, that when you speak of Israel, you're talking about a covenantal reality, primarily above and beyond and over a biological reality.
Totally.
Which is why we can speak of the church as God's Israel.
That's what Paul does.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting, I just thought of this. There's like 2 or 3 things that are floating around in my mind, and this is the one that just popped up, but there's another one I want to talk about a little later. But so this concept is actually one that I think divides the thinking between a Baptist and a Paedo-Baptist position. Okay, and the reason why I'm thinking of this now is I'm reading a book that is defending the Reformed Baptist position, just to make sure I really understand that position, and their understanding of the Abrahamic sign, the signs given, circumcision and stuff given to this old covenant people, is that they were given because in that covenant the natural genetic passing on of people was holy, and circumcision just confirms that holiness, right?
Okay.
So it's like you already have it, right? You already have it. You're already a son of Abraham. That's what you need. And then the circumcision is a sign confirming what you already have. Yeah. But I actually think that's
an argument for Paedo.
Well, like there's the position that I think you would need to take based on what, like, thinking about mixed multitude coming in, right? Is that you are not a recipient of this old covenant position because you are a natural seed of Abraham. Yeah. Even the natural seed of Abraham had to be brought in through covenantal signs. Yes. Right? And so the same thing meaning the idea that the old covenant is all about the natural seed, I think that there is too much priority put on that, and we don't understand that circumcision is actually it's like an act of bringing somebody who's not into the promises. I mean, it's like a distinguishing you from being just the natural seed to now bearing a covenantal promise that is over you. But it's not, that has to be believed in. You have to have faith.
That would make more sense of the conflict in Galatians.
Yeah,
the circumcision is the way in.
Yes,
it's not just an acknowledgement of something that's already there.
Yep, exactly. Yep. So interesting. Just that just popped up in my mind, and I think that we have to understand the old covenant people as not being primarily one of natural seed, although it is
that's part of it.
It's part of it, and I think that I don't have a problem saying there's continuity there because we still have natural seed, but the natural seed still needs to be brought into the covenant.
I want to say it was it Sinclair Ferguson? It was I think it was him. He was talking to, like, statistically that over 90% of professing believers come from believing homes. And as much as we want to talk about evangelism outside of the church, which is we are called to do, and it is important, we don't want to ignore that the primary mechanism that God uses is a family, is a Christian family, right?
Yes,
and that's not an automatic thing, but it is a thing.
It is a thing, and it's tied to, like, if you start thinking about how the Great Commission is a revamping of the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate of be fruitful and multiply. Those two things are not separate. They're together. And in fact, the primary mode, in terms of first mode, not in terms of, I don't know, maybe it is primary, but in terms of first is being the normal succession of, covenantal succession of you have kids and you teach them about your Lord. Like that's why there's so much of that in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, okay, so that was the one thing that came up. The other thing is this. So talking about the firstborn son stuff you're talking about earlier.
Yep.
The idea of firstborn having not just a status of consecration, but a consecration for the sake of mission or calling, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the things you kind of tie this to is the firstborn is being consecrated for service, reminds them or reenacts for them that they, as the firstborn, are consecrated for service. And I think you mentioned in your sermon too, like they're to be a light to the nations.
Yeah.
And so it made me think about how God intentionally works into our life these different applications in terms of spheres, like maybe I'm using the language of Kuyper to talk about different orientations towards the world and our personal life. So, for instance, a pastor, right, or a priest in the Old Covenant had a very specific service that they did representing God to his people, right? That's the service that a priest and a pastor did. They represent God to the people. And back then it was the firstborn who was doing that before things changed over to Levi.
Yeah.
And Israel is the firstborn. And so what does that mean? They're supposed to represent God to the world, right?
Yeah.
To the nations.
I would say to the nations. Yeah.
Yes, to the nations. And so you have this kind of like concentric circles of callings, right? So in the tighter community, like you have somebody who has this calling to you, and then you as the whole nation have this calling to the nations.
Yes.
And that makes sense. And that's very similar to how Peter talks about us, the church being a royal priesthood.
Yeah.
Right.
And a holy nation.
Yeah. And so, but those two callings have different applications.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Like the priesthood towards the pastor towards the church is a unique calling that looks different than the nation shining light on the other nations. You know what I mean? It's like this.
Yeah.
There's a difference there, and I think that it kind of
it's like it's a micro version.
Yeah.
Of it in a sense, right? So when Paul in Colossians speaks of Christ as the firstborn of creation, right? He's clearly not saying Jesus is a created being. Yeah. He's not saying he's the first one. He's speaking of dominion and authority and preeminence and the creation, right, belongs to Jesus. Jesus is like a firstborn, just like the firstborn would be the executor of the estate of the Father, right? Yeah. So all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto Christ. He's the firstborn over all creation. It's all his. He is the one who's managing it, and right? Yeah. So to say that Israel is firstborn as a nation means that they have a God-given role and an authority among the nations, a preeminence. Yeah. And a missional calling to be a light to those nations, so that through the life of Israel, the firstborn, the nations would be drawn to God. They would come to God.
Yeah, and I think about I was getting in my mind really practical what this might mean. So, for instance, if you are a priest, a pastor over a people, right? You have to know your people. You have to know what's going on, and you have to know how to apply the word to that situation, right? Yeah. You have to know what their sins are. You have to know what their temptations are, and given the current particular place they are in. Right. And I started thinking, okay, so I think that this idea of being a royal priesthood, a holy nation, where a priesthood for what? For the nations, right?
Mm-hmm. For the nations, yeah.
And so I think there's some practical applications there. I would say that's justification for why the church ought to care about what's going on in the world. Like the church ought to care about policies, and church ought to care about these things that are affecting, have downstream effects that are just terrible for nations. And I think that
I'm going to press that more. It's not just that the church should care; it's that the church should speak.
100%.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. It's not like, oh, we should be concerned about things. Yeah, we should be concerned about things, but that concern, that calling should cause us to speak. So in Israel as a nation, one of the ways, and we know that this actually did happen, was that through their laws and justice, the nations would look at that and go, who is that? What kind of God has these kind of rules? And we know that actually worked out, right? If we can go from Israel as a nation to the church as like a community within the community, or the city within the city, or whatever, like we are supposed to be living in such a way that is showing our community, according to God's laws and his righteousness and justice, we're showing our community what justice actually looks like, right? Which means we have something to say, not just something to be concerned about.
Yeah, and I think that I guess the reason why I bring up care is like, I think that there's a kind of mindset Christians fall into that they honestly like, they think it's almost a spiritual discipline to not know what's going on in the world. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not gonna spend any time like I've brought up certain things like, did you know this happened? People are like, I have no clue that was happening. It's like kind of important. Like there's, I mean, that kind of stuff. And not to say everybody is called to know, but I think I think there is a Christian calling to be aware, to know, to understand what's going on, so that you can speak, right? So it's like even before you speak, you have to be aware of what's going on. And I think that sometimes there's a tendency to think, my job as a Christian is limited to my just this little sphere, in such a way that I just don't care about anything that's going on in the world. And I think that's what God wants us to do, not care about what's going on in the world. And I think that I think that maybe sometimes they do that because they don't want to fear what's going on in the world, and they think that but I think that in some ways it's because they just think that they forgetting that there's a priesthood role the church has to care about what's going on.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So also the theme of firstborn, like it gives you a way of understanding idolatry. So Israel has this identity by grace that they are God's firstborn, which means God is their father, right? And what happens with Israel is they're acting like they belong to another dad, right? And so all of the downstream, the command, like the second table of the law, all of that stuff, justice, mercy, loving your neighbor, all of that is in line with living like God is your father. Like you're his kid. Right. And denying that leads to the rebellion and to sin.
Yeah. I think that the more I think about this firstborn motif, it's pretty inexhaustible. There's a lot of ways firstborn is used in the Bible. Like you brought up Jesus being the firstborn of all creation. I'm like, oh yeah, there's that too. There's like
firstborn from among the dead.
We didn't even talk about resurrection as in terms of Christ being the firstborn with relation to his resurrection. But rich motif, one worth studying. Okay, one last thing I wanted to chat on.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to dig a little deeper into. We touched on a little bit, but I did want to dig a little deeper into the mixed multitude thing. Because the I guess in particular the way that this mixed, like there's a dispensational way of looking back on the Old Testament in such a way that it's almost like the Gentiles never got in until Christ came. Right. And yet there's a huge opening of the covenant to the Gentiles when Christ does come in, or when Christ does come. So how would you? It's clear from the Old Testament. There's several instances in the Old Testament where Gentiles are being brought in. Right. One of my favorite stories is how Moses marries the Cushite, and Miriam gets ticked off, and then Miriam gets cursed with leprosy. But like, where did that Cushite come from? Well, she was one of the mixed multitude who came in, right?
Yeah.
So
I was just reading about Elijah. Elijah was what was he?
Tishbite, right?
Yeah, Tishbite. You're like reading all these different things. You go, wait, that's not Jewish.
I know, right?
He kind of had a big role.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you start to study the Old Testament with an eye towards who are these people, because you realize it's more broad than you thought. But yet there is a huge emphasis in the New Testament on the Gentiles being brought in. So that's kind of my question. I guess it's not so much based on this text, more of a question flows out of this text. Is what's the difference between what we have in the New Covenant towards the Gentiles versus what the Old Covenant had?
Yeah. So I think one like to untangle one strand from that issue. Gosh, I just forgot what I was going to say.
I love it when that happens.
Man, I'm getting too old. Well, the first thing is, Abraham, not even Abraham was a Jew.
That's true.
If you want to go literally there, right?
From the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, right?
That's right. What is the question you just asked? I had this really good idea, and it's just gone.
The question I asked was, so what? Given that there are a mixed multitude and a lot of Gentiles, part of God's people in the Old Covenant, what is, and yet the New Testament makes such a heavy emphasis on the inclusion of the Gentiles. What's the huge distinction between the Old Covenant and New Covenant in this regard?
Yeah, the thought is gone. It was a really, really good idea. Oh, no, here it is. Okay, here's what it is.
Yay, good. It's back.
When Paul is, I think people misunderstand Paul's attacks.
Okay.
Or even Jesus's critiques in the Gospels. Okay. When people read that, what they think is that Jesus is critiquing the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Or the Old Covenant. Or that he's critiquing Judaism. And those critiques are not a critique of the Old Testament. They are a critique of a perversion of the Old Testament.
Exactly.
And you need to make that
stuff. Yeah.
Yes, you need to understand that that's going on, or else you're going to have a critical view of the Old Covenant and see it. You're going to conflate and confuse Old Covenant, which has been replaced, right, and supplanted by the New Covenant, which is new and better for sure. But the critiques are not against the Old Covenant. The critiques are against not even Judaism, but a perverted version of Judaism. And I think you have to understand that, or else you're going to see the Old Testament. You're going to say, oh, the problems that Jesus is addressing, those are problems with the Old Covenant. They're not problems with the Old Covenant. They're problems with the Pharisees. Yes. And those are not the same thing.
Not the same thing. It's so funny the way you said that.
That's the idea. I couldn't remember that.
It's the way you said that reminded me of something else. It reminds me of the Reformation, because the Reformation was a fight against the Reformers were fighting the established Roman Catholic Church, but the fight wasn't we've got this new thing and it's something the church never knew. And you guys need to like bow to our interpretation of it. The Reformers were saying this is what the original like understanding of the gospel was. Let me go back to not just the Bible, but let me go back to the patristics. Let me go back to all the way up into even some of the late 10th, 12th century guys. Yeah. And the Reformers were saying your doctrine is not Christian. Like they were saying, we are the true Catholic Church. You guys, you are basically a synagogue of Satan, right? Yeah. And that's the same idea that's happening in Jesus's interactions with the Pharisees, because he's always attacking that they have kicked the Bible to the curb and obeying instead the traditions of men.
Yeah, and so you can misinterpret that and say what Jesus is saying is they need less Old Testament, and that's not what he's saying.
No,
he's saying you don't understand the Old Testament. So one of the ways where you can pick that up and get it confused is when Jesus critiques and he says, "You've heard that it was said, right? But I tell you."
Yep.
People people think that that's a critique of the Old Testament, but it's not. It's a critique of the traditions of men. That's why he says, you have heard that it was said, your teachers have taught you wrongly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And it's important to make that distinction that what Paul is fighting against and what Jesus is critiquing in the Gospels is a perverted version of Judaism that had become very ethnocentric. That's not what it was, but that's what it had. That's what it had become. Very exclusive. There's all sorts. There's the story of the guy who goes to the synagogue and he's praying and thankful that you didn't make me like one of those dogs, essentially. Yeah, and it's like that mentality doesn't come from faithful Old Covenant theology. That comes from a perversion of it.
Yep.
And so I think you got to understand that, or otherwise you're not going to understand what's happening in the Old Covenant, and you're not going to understand what both Jesus and Paul are trying to correct. Under the New Covenant.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to then go. So it's almost like God is correcting the perversions, right, by the fulfillment of Christ fulfilling the Old Covenant in terms of the ceremonial stuff is also God correcting the perversions of the ceremonial stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like it's because when he comes, all the ceremonial stuff goes away, and that's what the all the traditions were kind of like built on top of perversions of that stuff, right? Like we're going to keep distance from Gentiles because if you extra distance from Gentiles, because if you go into a Gentile's house, you're not fit to come to worship, or there's all these things, right? That they built on top of the ceremonial law. But so when the ceremonial law has finally come to an end, they have because it's been fulfilled in Christ, then there's just like this floodgates open for the Gentiles to come in. And that actually seems to be why the Pharisees and the Jews who reject Jesus hate him so much, right? Because he tears down their traditions, but he also he takes away the pride of the kind of pride of an ethnocentric firstborn, right?
Yeah. And there's a massive correcting measure that takes place. So in Deuteronomy, God tells his people, it wasn't because you were mightier or stronger or bigger than any of the nations, but you were the smallest, right? And the point is there that Israel is Israel because of God's grace. And so grace always levels the playing field. That an Israelite is an Israelite because of God's grace, and a Gentile can become part of that community because of that same grace, right? And if you don't get that, then you get the two-tiered systems. Then you get the self-righteousness. And I was just thinking this morning when I was walking about the parable of the prodigal son. And how like the prodigal son and the obedient son can belong in the same covenant by the same means. It's the same thing. It's grace. And I think that is what's driving the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the law crazy.
It is. It's grace.
Yeah. As a side note, maybe we'll talk about this in the next one, but that thought I had was spurred by the conversation you and I had after church yesterday. About the father and the prodigal son in that story. Right? How some people want to imagine that he went in the pig trough and was laying with his son in the mud, eating the crap. It's like, no, he was at home. And when the prodigal came home, he received him.
Yes. Yes, I know what you're talking about. It's an important distinction.
The father was at home.
Maybe we'll spring that one up in the next episode.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening to Sermon B-Sides. Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See ya.
See ya.